December 6th, 1944. A wind, carrying the sharp, unrelenting bite of winter, swept across the vast Midwestern plains as the train slowly creaked to a halt near the gates of a prisoner of war camp nestled in Iowa. Its heavy steel wheels ground against the rails with a final, shuddering groan, and the women huddled inside, their coats tragically thin for the season, instinctively tightened their arms across their chests. They had been thoroughly conditioned to expect brutality. Back in Germany, the pervasive propaganda leaflets had promised it with chilling certainty. Captured women would be spat upon, stripped naked, forced into dehumanizing slave labor, or subjected to fates far worse. Many of the young auxiliaries whispered these paralyzing fears among themselves, pressing their faces against the frosted glass, desperately trying to glimpse the terror that surely awaited them in America. What they actually saw, however, unsettled them for reasons they could not yet begin to comprehend. Beyond the stark wire fences stretched seemingly endless rows of plain wooden barracks, their roofs blanketed thickly with fresh snow. Guards in heavy, insulated coats stamped their boots rhythmically against the piercing cold, while a kitchen chimney puffed steady plumes of white smoke into the pale, December sky. In the hazy distance, fields of dormant corn stood silent and stark, a ghostly quiet reminder that this was peaceful farmland, not the ravaged landscape of a battlefield. For some of these women, it was the first truly quiet, undisturbed landscape they had encountered in years. Yet, far from offering solace, the profound silence only seemed to deepen their gnawing unease. Among them was a nurse, just 23 years old, who had been captured outside Aachen as the Allied forces relentlessly pushed toward the Rhine. Her name, unfortunately, does not survive in any official records, but her personal diary would later capture the profound impact of this particular day, with a single, poignant line. I stepped onto American soil, expecting chains, but the only weight I felt was my own heartbeat. That heartbeat thumped violently against her ribs as she and the others were sternly ordered to line up on the windswept platform. They were utterly exhausted from the arduous Atlantic crossing, their bodies still swaying subtly with the lingering memory of the ship's relentless roll and the weeks of tense, guarded silence endured during their transport. Not a single woman spoke as the guards' boots crunched across the ice, forcing them into formation. The officers barked instructions in English, a language few among the German women understood. A translator then repeated these commands in German, his voice surprisingly calm, almost polite already. This was utterly strange. Back home, Americans had been depicted as savage barbarians with knives clenched between their teeth, merchants of chaos who would show no mercy whatsoever. Yet here, the commands carried none of the raw hatred or vitriol they had been led to expect. The guards seemed more bored than cruel, shifting their rifles in gloved hands, as if their greatest desire was simply to return to the warmth of their barrack. Still, the women braced themselves for the inevitable. The POW camps in the Soviet Union were widely rumored to be virtual death sentences. Surely the Americans, their sworn enemy, would not be so different. They waited with bated breath for jeers, for shouts of "Schweine," for the stripping away of their last vestiges of dignity. Instead, they were led orderly, almost briskly, toward a building where the rich, inviting scent of strong coffee drifted tantalizingly on the air. Coffee. The aroma startled them more profoundly than any shouted threat ever could have. Many had not tasted the drink in months. In Germany, it had long since become an extravagant luxury, often replaced with roasted barley or bitter acorns. Yet here, remarkably, in enemy hands, this rich aroma promised a sense of familiarity they instinctively distrusted. A U.S. Army report from that winter notes the arrival of a group of female auxiliaries, numbering approximately 50, and tersely describes their condition as fatigued but in satisfactory health. The report, clinical and detached, makes no mention of the palpable fear, no acknowledgement of the way these women's eyes darted anxiously at every gesture, every door that opened. To the American officers, they were simply prisoners to be processed, another logistical line item in the expanding, all-consuming war effort. But to the women, every subtle movement, every glance, mattered immensely. When an American soldier held the door open for them, they hesitated, unsure whether it was a deliberate trick, When he gestured again, impatient but notably not unkind, they shuffled inside, their boots squeaking faintly against the polished wooden floor. Inside, a wave of warmth flushed their pale cheeks. The barracks smelled faintly of comforting soap and boiled potatoes. Long tables were already set with tin cups and plates, waiting expectantly. A Red Cross volunteer, her hair neatly tucked beneath a practical wool cap, stood nearby, quietly handing out soft blankets. She offered a gentle smile, a gesture so ordinary, so unexpected, that it nearly undid one of the younger prisoners, who bit her lip hard to keep from openly weeping. The simple, unadorned kindness felt dangerous, as if to accept it was to betray everything she had been taught about the enemy. It was in this precise moment that their deeply ingrained expectations first began to crack. The women had braced themselves for unbridled cruelty. Instead, they found themselves disarmed by an unexpected civility. This, too, was a potent weapon of sorts, though they did not yet recognize its true power. The United States, unlike many other combatants, had solemnly pledged strict adherence to the Geneva Convention of 1929. Prisoners of war were to be fed, properly housed, and allowed to correspond with their families. The Germans had signed that treaty as well, but had often callously ignored its tenets. Now, these women were encountering the strange, unsettling reality of Americans honoring it, even extending its principles beyond the letter of the law. One prisoner later wrote, with lingering confusion, "They gave us beds with clean sheets. I thought of my brother on the Eastern Front, sleeping in frozen mud, and I could not understand why the enemy treated us better than our own leaders treated him." This profound confusion cut deeper than any insult or physical blow could have. For women who had swallowed years of insidious propaganda, the camp was an unsettling revelation, a stark challenge to their worldview. And yet, suspicion still stubbornly lingered. Perhaps this unexpected hospitality was merely temporary, a cruel joke before the real, brutal punishment inevitably began. Perhaps the Americans were fattening them for some unknown, sinister purpose. The guards spoke little. The translators offered no reassurances beyond the basic rules of camp life: work details, strict curfews, mandatory roll calls. These were explained clearly and concisely. Everything else remained shrouded in mystery. Night fell quickly and mercilessly in those Midwestern winters, draping the entire camp in a heavy silence broken only by the rhythmic crunch of sentry boots and the low, mournful whistle of wind against the barbed wire. The women lay awake on their bunks, listening intently, waiting. Some whispered prayers, others stared blankly at the ceiling, vividly imagining the bombs falling on their hometowns half a world away. A few clutched precious photographs, creases worn into the faces of husbands and brothers they might never see again. In those first few nights, they remained prisoners not only of the camp's physical confines but also of their own overwhelming fear. Yet, memory is a stubborn, resilient thing. Even in the weeks that followed, as mundane routines gradually settled in, the vivid image of that first arrival lingered: the comforting coffee steam, the unexpected warmth of the blanket, the simple, genuine smile of a volunteer. These intimate details clashed violently with the dire warnings of cruelty they had so fiercely believed. And beneath that profound clash lay a seed, fragile but utterly undeniable: the dawning possibility that the enemy was not the monstrous entity they had been systematically taught to fear. What they could not yet know was how this delicate seed would be watered, how it would grow and blossom in the most unlikely and profound of ways. For in the bustling kitchens of these very camps, amid bags of flour, heaps of sugar, and fresh apples harvested from nearby farms, the Americans were preparing something far stranger and more subversive than mere discipline or interrogation. They were meticulously preparing hospitality, served not in eloquent words, but in deeply resonant flavors. The women had braced themselves for harsh blows. Instead, they would soon be offered a taste of mercy, cunningly disguised as dessert. And when that moment finally came, it would shake them more profoundly, more fundamentally, than the crash of any battlefield ever could. The mornings in the camp began not with screams or blows, but with the sharp, clear clang of a bell. The women stirred beneath their rough wool blankets, the air crisp with the mingled scent of soap, cold smoke, and damp wood. For some, the initial days were the hardest, not because of any overt cruelty, but because of the profoundly disorienting absence of it. They had expected oppressive darkness and heavy chains, yet what they found instead was order, predictable routine, and a strange kind of normality that unsettled them more deeply than any brutality ever could have. They filed out of the barracks into the biting winter chill, their breath puffing like smoke against the pale horizon. Guards with rifles slung casually across their shoulders counted them quickly, with an air of boredom, as though this were just another mundane job. The women, still deeply cautious, kept their eyes lowered, half expecting any moment for the illusion of civility to shatter, but the illusion did not break. Instead, they were marched toward the mess hall, where the air was warm, and the comforting smell of freshly baked bread drifted invitingly from the ovens. One German nurse later admitted, with a catch in her throat, that she had cried at the sight of real butter on the table. In her besieged hometown, such richness had vanished long before she was ever captured. The camp was by no means a paradise. It was fenced, heavily patrolled, and rigidly bound by rules. Freedom was undeniably gone, but within those circumscribed limits, life was far less savage and brutal than they had ever dared to imagine. Each barrack held rows of sturdy wooden bunks, mattresses stuffed with straw, and small lockers for personal items. There were washing stations, though the water often ran cold, and there were even classrooms where American officers cautiously encouraged language lessons. Some of the women laughed bitterly at this proposition. Learning English, they scoffed, was simply preparing for defeat. Yet more than a few attended, driven by curiosity, drawn by the novelty of actual books and chalk at a time when the outside world was crumbling into chaos. An official U.S. Army ration report from 1944 starkly reveals that prisoners of war were entitled to nearly the same daily caloric intake as American soldiers. Beans, potatoes, canned meat, bread, margarine, sugar, coffee was served, though often weak, leading to inevitable complaints. One diary entry, carefully preserved from a German auxiliary in Texas, reads with dry irony, "They serve us coffee like water, but at least it is warm." The profound irony was certainly not lost on her complaining about the strength of the enemy's coffee, while her family back home was boiling acorns to survive. It was in such stark contrast that the women's confusion only deepened. They had expected the Americans to strip away their dignity, to humiliate them. Instead, they found themselves treated with a politeness and consideration that felt almost cruel in its profound civility. Letters from the War Department constantly reminded camp commandants that strict adherence to the Geneva Convention was not optional. It was mandatory. And yet, beyond the rigid rules, there was something else at play, something distinctly cultural. In the evenings, church groups from nearby towns sometimes visited, their earnest voices singing hymns in English, their melodies drifting softly across the fences. The women listened in silence, both comforted and profoundly disturbed, for these songs of mercy came from those they had been relentlessly told were merciless. Some adjusted remarkably quickly. They knitted and sewed. They gardened in small springtime plots, meticulously tilled within the fences. They even performed plays for one another, using scraps of fabric and makeshift props, finding fleeting moments of creative expression. Others, however, simply could not bear the jarring dissonance. One 30-year-old prisoner is recorded as saying, with raw bitterness, "Every kindness is a wound. My brothers starve, and they give me bread." She often turned away from meals, eating only the bare minimum, as if to stubbornly prove she could still suffer for Germany. Yet the body often betrays the will, and soon enough, even she was seen dipping her bread into the weak but fragrant coffee, savoring what her physical being simply could not resist. The guards noticed these bewildering contradictions. Some laughed quietly among themselves, remarking how strange it was to watch enemy prisoners squabble good-naturedly over the thickness of soup, while American families rationed precious sugar and meat for the war effort. "We treat them better than we treat our own boys," one sergeant muttered, not without a hint of bitterness. And in truth, the government allocated roughly $1.60 per day for each prisoner's rations more, at times, than for a U.S. infantryman fighting fiercely in the Ardennes. War has its profound absurdities, and this was undeniably one of them. The women gradually began to form new routines, Morning roll call, work assignments in the kitchens or laundry, brief walks along the inner yard. Winter sunlight glistened deceptively on the barbed wire, making it sparkle like holiday tinsel. They laughed nervously at the sight, mocking it yet secretly aching with a profound longing for home. Some scratched intricate calendars into the wooden walls, marking the passing days with little crosses. Others wrote poignant letters on thin paper provided by the Red Cross, though they often waited agonizing months for replies, if replies came at all. Yet, for all the imposed order, suspicion stubbornly lingered. What if this kindness was merely temporary? What if it was simply bait, a deceptive mask covering some darker, more sinister plan? The idea festered, born of ingrained fear and relentless propaganda, but slowly, inexorably, it began to lose its suffocating grip. The longer they lived within the camp, the more vividly reality contradicted the nightmare images they had carried across the vast ocean. No beatings, no starvation, no overt humiliation. Instead, rules, routines, the weary boredom of mere survival. And beneath it all, an unsettling, undeniable truth. They were being treated as human beings. That profound truth left many restless and conflicted. It was far easier to hate an enemy when he was a monstrous fiend. It was infinitely harder when he was a man with a gentle drawl, a guard who subtly slipped them extra sugar packets, or a kind chaplain who offered sincere prayers for their families back in war-torn Europe. One of the younger women confessed to another, whispering under her blanket in the dead of night, "I do not know how to hate them anymore. And if I cannot hate them, what do I have left?" The question hung heavy and unanswerable in the cold, still air. Not all moments were soft or peaceful. Fights occasionally broke out among the prisoners themselves, sparked by rumors, deep-seated rivalries, or sheer despair. One evening, a heated scuffle over a letter escalated until guards intervened. But even then, the punishment was a stern lecture, not the brutal violence they had so fearfully braced for. Slowly, gradually, their concept of the enemy eroded. Slowly, they began to see undeniable cracks in the fabricated stories they had been told. The snow melted, spring approached with hesitant steps, and vibrant gardens sprouted within the wire. Women knelt in the rich soil, planting seeds with hands that had once dressed grievous wounds on distant battlefields. The profound irony did not escape them. They had crossed an ocean as prisoners, captives of war, yet here they were, coaxing new life from American soil. They lived in captivity, yes, but for some, it felt like the first breath of fresh air after years of suffocating war. Still, the central, nagging question remained. Why? Why would Americans waste precious resources to treat enemy women with such unexpected civility when their own sons were dying overseas? The women puzzled over it endlessly, each passing day deepening the mystery. And although the answer was layered, part legal obligation, part cultural ethos, part strategic calculation, its most potent and profound expression was yet to come. For just beyond the kitchens, the tantalizing smell of something sweet was beginning to rise. Flour, sugar, butter, and crisp apples were being transformed by local, caring hands into a dish both ordinary and utterly extraordinary. The women could not yet know it, but soon they would be invited to taste it, and when they did, the solid walls of belief they had carried across the sea would shudder in ways no prison fence could ever hope to contain. It began with a smell, sweet, warm, and impossible to mistake, the comforting scent of apples baked with cinnamon and sugar, drifting through the mess hall like a precious memory of home. The women looked up from their tin trays, their eyes darting anxiously toward the kitchen door, as if the fragrance itself were a deceptive trick of their imagination. Many had not seen fresh fruit in months. In Germany, by late 1944, apples were rare commodities, hoarded greedily or shriveled from unscrupulous sellers. To smell them here, surprisingly, in captivity, was like being taunted with the sweet ghost of childhood. Some stiffened instantly in suspicion, others closed their eyes, letting the evocative scent transport them briefly elsewhere, to a forgotten time. The door swung open, and what entered was stranger and more unsettling than any rumor they had carried across the vast Atlantic. Not soldiers, not guards, but women in thick winter coats. American church volunteers, their cheeks flushed pink from the cold, balancing heavy trays meticulously covered with golden-crusted pies. Their boots squeaked softly against the floorboards as they carefully set the trays down on the serving table. They smiled awkwardly, unsure whether to meet the direct gaze of the prisoners. The German women stared back, stunned into a profound silence. One whispered half to herself, her voice barely audible, "Why would they waste such food on us?" A guard coughed, embarrassed by the sudden, heavy stillness, and motioned for the serving to begin. A generous slice was placed on each tray. Flaky crust, steaming apples, a hint of rich butter that slowly melted into the tin plate. The prisoners hesitated. Forks hovered uncertainly. Hands trembled slightly. They had braced themselves for gnawing hunger, for harsh punishment, not for unexpected sweetness. To taste it felt almost like an act of surrender. Yet hunger, primal and insistent, is often louder than pride. Slowly, cautiously, they raised the first delicate bites to their mouths. What happened then could never have been truly captured by the official reports, which merely record that local women's groups delivered baked goods to prisoners. But in private diaries, and later heartfelt testimonies, the profound moment reappears again and again, with startling clarity. A 20-year-old Luftwaffe auxiliary described it in a letter written years later. "I bit into that pie, and it was as if the war slipped away for one heartbeat. I remembered my grandmother's kitchen, the way she cooled pies on the windowsill. I did not want to remember, but the taste forced me to." For others, the intense sweetness was almost unbearable. One prisoner set her fork down and began to weep quietly, her shoulders shaking in silent, profound sorrow. Another muttered angrily that it was manipulation, a cunning way to soften them, to make them forget the men dying bravely in Europe. But even she, by the very end of the meal, had finished her entire slice. The body, after all, craves what the heart stubbornly resists. The irony was certainly not lost on the guards, who exchanged amused, knowing glances. "They thought we'd whipped them," one private remarked later. "And here we were feeding them pie. Maybe that's the best propaganda we ever had." He wasn't entirely wrong. The War Department actively encouraged acts of humane treatment, not only to strictly comply with the Geneva Convention, but also to stand as living rebuttals to vicious Nazi accusations of American barbarity. In that mess hall, at that moment, the strategy was working in ways far more intimate and personal than any leaflet dropped from the sky. The German women did not trust easily. Even as they licked lingering cinnamon from the edges of their forks, they wondered anxiously at the true motive. Were the pies poisoned? Were they meant to utterly humiliate them? But the Americans ate cheerfully from the same trays, smiling with sticky fingers, wiping crumbs from their chins. The volunteers spoke softly, sometimes in broken German or with the universal language of gesture, asking about families, offering seconds to those who dared to meet their eyes. In one quiet corner, the nurse who had first stepped off the train weeks earlier found herself staring intently at the crust in her hand. She had expected chains, then found soft blankets, expected starvation, then found warm stew. Now she expected nothing at all. Yet here was a gift she simply could not explain. She took a bite, closed her eyes, and in that fleeting moment, memory betrayed her completely. She saw her mother dusting flour across a well-worn wooden table, her little sister licking sugar from her fingertip. She had spent years swallowing bitter hatred, feeding herself on hollow slogans. Yet here, remarkably, in enemy hands, came a taste that disarmed her more profoundly than any bullet ever could. Not every woman yielded so quickly or completely. Some stubbornly shoved the pie aside, untouched, defiant against the overwhelming temptation. But even their defiance rang hollow, for the pervasive scent filled the entire room, seeping into every breath. It was not just food. It was a potent symbol. It was a subtle weapon. It was a profound paradox. The sweetness forced them to reckon with the truth they had been so vehemently warned against. The enemy could, in fact, be merciful. A U.S. chaplain who had accompanied the church women later recalled, with a thoughtful expression, "My mother always said, feed them pie, not hatred. Show them who we are." I didn't know if it would make a difference, but when I saw those girls' faces, I knew something had shifted. He was right. It was a small shift, almost invisible to the casual observer, but it was undeniably real. Some prisoners scribbled hurried notes that night, recording the experience in a cryptic code so censors might let the letters pass. One wrote, "With a touch of wonder, the enemy's greatest weapon is butter." Another confessed that she had dreamed of pies cooling on her grandmother's windowsill, a dream sweeter and more comforting than any she had allowed herself since the war began. The simple dessert had unsettled them more deeply than hunger ever could. There was humor, too, though it came in hushed, tentative tones. One woman joked that perhaps the Americans hoped to make them fat so they could not possibly run if escape was ever feasible. Another teased that the crust was too thick, that her mother's recipe was undeniably better. Laughter, tentative and fragile, broke the long silence that had hung heavily over the barracks for weeks. It startled them to hear it, the unexpected sound of genuine joy in captivity. But beneath the laughter lay a simmering unease. For what did it truly mean if the enemy was kind? What did it mean if the same hands that held formidable rifles could also gently offer pie? If America was not the barbaric giant they had been relentlessly taught to despise, then what else, truly, had been a lie? That unsettling question lingered like a persistent aftertaste, long after the crumbs were gone. The guards efficiently cleaned the hall. Volunteers gathered their trays, and the women returned to their bunks with full stomachs and profoundly restless hearts. Some lay awake, replaying the taste in their minds, torn between burgeoning gratitude and gnawing guilt. Others resisted fiercely, swearing never to be softened by mere sugar. But their resistance was brittle, for every bite had carried not just flavor, but a profound challenge to fundamentally reconsider who the enemy truly was. The pie was not just food. It was ideology wrapped in flaky pastry. It was America saying, without speeches or grand pronouncements, "We will fight you with bombs, but we will also fight you with mercy." And mercy, in its quiet, insidious way, was far harder to resist than any steel. The women could not yet know how deeply this moment would mark them, how it would echo through the years later when the war finally ended, when some would return home to utter ruins, and others would find themselves strangely longing for the unsettling civility of their captivity. For now, all they knew was that nothing in their rigorous training, nothing in their pervasive propaganda, had prepared them for this, and the true shock had not yet come. For if apple pie could fundamentally shake their faith in old lies, what awaited them in the closing, tumultuous days of war would dismantle those deeply held beliefs entirely. By the spring of 1945, the fences no longer felt like a confining cage so much as a mere line on the distant horizon. The women still woke to the familiar clang of the morning bell, still lined up for roll call under the watchful eyes of guards. But something intangible, something profound, had shifted within them. They had come expecting hatred, and had found instead the steady monotony of dignity. They had tasted apple pie in the mess hall and felt their deepest convictions shudder. Now, as rumors of Germany's impending collapse seeped through the cracks of intercepted letters and whispered radio broadcasts, the prisoners discovered that captivity was reshaping them in ways they could not possibly have imagined. The nurse who had once braced for heavy chains now found herself patiently teaching English phrases to her bunkmates, amused at how American words curled awkwardly and unfamiliar in their mouths. The 30-year-old who had so fiercely resisted meals out of loyalty to her suffering brothers now spent her afternoons tending a small, verdant garden inside the fence, coaxing tender beans and crisp cucumbers from the fertile soil. Even laughter, the previously unthinkable sounds, which had felt like treason in those initial weeks, now swelled more frequently on the gentle spring air. Yet, with every act of kindness came an unwelcome pang of guilt. "We eat well," one woman confided to her diary, "while our families dig through rubble for mere crusts of bread. How can this possibly be right?" This profound paradox became the central torment of their existence behind the wire. To accept such unexpected mercy from the enemy was, in essence, to concede that the horrific stories of cruelty they had been told were baseless lies. To find comfort while one's homeland faced starvation was to bear an agonizing burden of shame. Nevertheless, these comforts persisted and even expanded. Local townspeople generously donated books, soft blankets, and even musical instruments. Some evenings, the camp resonated with the heartfelt strains of violins and harmonicas, played by prisoners who unearthed melodies from a life now distant. Even the guards listened quietly, perhaps finding in the music a faint echo of their own homes far away. War had forged them into enemies, but captivity had forced an inescapable proximity, and that closeness inevitably began to blur the sharp, ideological edges between them. When Germany finally surrendered in May, the camp's reaction was not one of celebratory cheers, but of a profound, stunned silence. The women gathered in hushed clusters around the bulletin board at the gate, its English declaration translated laboriously, line by painstaking line. Hitler was dead. The Reich had fallen. For some, a wave of relief washed over them, yet it was inextricably mingled with an overwhelming grief. For others, disbelief hardened into a bitter, unyielding resentment. A young auxiliary was overheard whispering in stunned bewilderment, "It cannot be true. We were told we would never be defeated." Yet the undeniable truth hung heavy in the air, suffocatingly real. Their homeland lay shattered, their families scattered and vulnerable, and here they were, inexplicably safe, well-fed, and warm, within the very land of their declared enemy. Letters began to trickle in with a devastating, agonizing slowness. One woman learned that her cherished home in Cologne had been reduced to nothing but rubble. Another received the news that her mother had perished in a brutal air raid. Many, heartbreakingly, received no word at all, leaving them suspended in agonizing uncertainty. At night, the barracks filled with the muffled sounds of sobs, grief spilling out into the encompassing dark. And yet, every morning, the mess hall still carried the comforting scent of fresh bread. The garden outside continued to flourish, and sometimes, when the benevolent churchwomen visited, there was still pie, but the sweetness tasted profoundly different now. It was no longer merely startling. Its very gentleness had become almost unbearable. The ideological rupture was now complete, utterly shattering their previous worldview. For years, these women had been systematically indoctrinated, taught that America was a land populated by monstrous beings, a place where cruelty reigned supreme. Yet these supposed monsters had provided them with music, books, soap, and sustenance. These monsters had even served them pie. For many, this stark contradiction festered, becoming a psychological wound that would never truly heal. Decades later, interviews with former POWs would reveal the profound depth of this lingering dissonance. "I could not reconcile it," one woman confessed, her voice still laced with bewilderment. "I came to hate our own leaders more than the enemy. They lied to us, and the Americans, astonishingly, proved it with simple butter and apples." Some of these women would ultimately return to Germany after the war ended, stepping off ships into cities reduced to hollowed husks by relentless bombing. They carried with them the indelible memory of the camp, the fences, the blankets, the perplexing, unexpected mercy. A select few, remarkably, made the extraordinary choice to return to America years later, immigrating, marrying, and painstakingly building new lives in the very land where they had once been held captive. Their children grew up speaking English, their kitchens often filled with the comforting aroma of pies cooling on windowsills. What had initially seemed like a weapon of ironic benevolence had, for them, transformed into a cherished tradition of belonging. But even those who never returned could never truly forget. The taste, the memory, followed them, lodged in their minds like an insistent splinter. They remembered the hesitant smiles of the volunteers, the chaplain's calming prayers, the guards who deliberately looked away when an extra scoop of sugar was taken. They remembered the profound shame of enjoying it, the gnawing guilt of surviving in better conditions than their own families back home. They remembered that in the darkest, most brutal winter of the war, the enemy had extended them mercy, while their own leaders had fed them only deceitful lies. The apple pie, in its unassuming simplicity, transcended its mere form to become a symbol far grander than itself. It represented the catastrophic collapse of a national myth, the shattering of a deeply ingrained illusion. Within its very sweetness lay the bitter sting of betrayal by their own regime, coupled with the bewildering, yet undeniable, recognition that profound humanity existed even on the other side of the war. It stood as irrefutable proof that America's most potent weapon was not solely the bomb or the rifle, but rather its astonishing capacity to disarm with simple kindness. One insightful prisoner captured this paradox perfectly in her journal. The pie tasted of childhood, of safety, of home, but it also tasted unmistakably of defeat. I could not eat without thinking of my mother struggling amidst the ruins. Yet I ate because I simply could not resist. And in that poignant moment, I knew the war was lost. Not because of armies, but because of the lie. Her words, hastily scribbled in pencil, miraculously survived the censors and the passage of decades, standing as a quiet testament to the profound revolution of spirit that had unfolded behind the barbed wire. When the last transports finally carried them back across the vast Atlantic, the women gazed at the distant shorelines of America one final time. Some, consumed by anger, spat into the sea, vowing never to forgive their captors for what they perceived as the profound humiliation of kindness. Others wept silently, knowing they were leaving behind a place where, for all its formidable iron fences, they had somehow felt safer and more cherished than they ever had under the oppressive shadow of the Reich. Each woman carried her own unique version of this complex memory, but none could ever truly deny its reality. The taste lingered, an enduring presence. Years later, in countless kitchens across Germany, daughters would inquire of their mothers about the war, and sometimes, when the subject of the war's devastation, the overwhelming rubble and loss, felt too heavy, too unbearable to articulate, the mothers would instead recount a different story. They would tell of the time the enemy had given them apple pie, and how it had tasted like mercy itself, blooming in the very middle of hell. The daughters would listen, bewildered and perhaps a little disoriented, and gradually begin to perceive the war, not merely in terms of its destruction, but also in fleeting, powerful flashes of shared humanity. The memory of pie in a prison camp is, on the surface, a small story, almost absurd in its domesticity against the colossal backdrop of a world at war. Yet, as history often proves, small stories frequently hold the greatest, most universal truths. For these women, the simple sweetness of apples and sugar marked the precise moment when myth utterly shattered and stark reality finally broke through. They had anticipated cruelty and instead discovered compassion. They had braced for starvation and astonishingly found bread. They had expected monsters and instead encountered men and women with ordinary, merciful hearts. And so the legacy endures, whispered across generations, that in the midst of history's darkest, most brutal conflict, a simple slice of apple pie served to remind prisoners and captors alike that even enemies are, at their core, human. But the question that continues to linger is far more unsettling. If such profound mercy could effortlessly reach across the barbed wire of war, what other fundamental lies had they been led to believe? And, chillingly, what else might have been possible all along?